Hi everyone, my name is Desiree and my presentation is going to be focusing on racial and ethnic discrimination in everyday life. I chose this topic because discrimination is often associated with obvious or intentional acts of prejudice. However, discrimination can also occur in subtle ways through everyday interactions, organizations, and institutions. In this presentation, I'll examine racial and ethnic discrimination as a social problem, including its causes, consequences, who may benefit from existing inequalities, who has the power to shape the conversation, and what can be done to create meaningful change. I'll also discuss the role that research and science can play in addressing this issue. Racial and ethnic discrimination matters because it can influence how people are perceived, treated, included, and given access to opportunities and resources. Research has examined discrimination in areas such as employment, housing, credit, and consumer markets. This means discrimination isn't limited to one particular setting. It can potentially affect multiple areas of a person's life. From a sociological perspective, that's important because an individual experience can sometimes reflect a much larger social pattern. When similar experiences occur repeatedly across different settings, we're no longer just looking at individual behavior, we're looking at a social problem. This topic is also personally meaningful to me. In my original assignment, I discussed an experience from my previous marriage. At that time, I had a last name that was commonly associated with a Caucasian background. I noticed that some interactions seemed different when people knew only my name compared to how they responded after meeting me and recognizing my ethnic background. I'm not presenting that experience as proof of discrimination. Instead, it made me just curious. I began asking whether experiences like this were isolated incidences or whether they reflected broader patterns. That question allowed me to move from a personal experience to a sociological question that could be examined through research. Racial and ethnic discrimination occurs when individuals or groups experience unequal treatment, opportunities, or access to resources because of perceived race, ethnicity, or cultural background. It can happen at several levels. At the individual level, it can involve stereotypes, prejudice, assumptions, or differential treatment. At the organizational level, it can influence hiring, promotions, policies, and decision-making. And at the structural level, it can be connected to institutions and larger social systems. This distinction is important because discrimination isn't always an obvious or intentional act between two individuals. It can also operate through organizations and social structures. So some of the feedback from my original assignment, my Part 1 assignment, suggested that I consider identifying the independent and dependent variables. So I've incorporated that into Part 2 of the critical assignment. The independent variable is racial and ethnic discrimination. This includes perceived race or ethnicity, stereotypes, bias, differential treatment, and institutional discrimination. The dependent variables are the potential outcomes. These include employment opportunities, economic mobility, housing access, education, health and well-being, and social inclusion. So my central research question is, how does racial and ethnic discrimination affect individual social norms, economic, and health outcomes? Racial and ethnic discrimination meets the characteristics of a social problem. It affects a significant number of people, is connected to social conditions, creates consequences beyond the individual, and requires collective responses. It can influence access to employment, housing, education, health, and economic opportunity. So the issue isn't simply that some individuals may have biased beliefs. The larger concern is what happens when those beliefs, assumptions, or practices influence people's opportunities and outcomes. That's where an individual experience becomes part of a larger sociological issue. There isn't one single cause of racial and ethnic discrimination. Socialization plays a role because people learn attitudes and assumptions from family, peers, schools, and communities. Cultural beliefs also matter. Stereotypes can be reinforced through media, social norms, and repeated assumptions about particular groups. Historical inequality is another factor. Past discrimination in areas such as housing, education, and employment can influence present-day conditions. And finally, institutional practices can contribute through decision involving hiring, housing, lending, education, and healthcare. So understanding discrimination requires looking at both individual attitudes and the social environments in which those attitudes develop and operate. Discrimination doesn't always look the same. Overt discrimination can involve explicit exclusion, racial slurs, threats, or clearly unequal treatment. Subtle discrimination can involve stereotypes, assumptions, microaggressions, or different expectations. Then there's institutional discrimination. That can occur through organizational practices, policies, and decision-making. This is important because many people have a very specific idea of what discrimination looks like. They may think that if there is no openly racist statement or obvious act of exclusion, then discrimination just isn't occurring. But contemporary discrimination may be much more difficult to recognize, which is also makes it much more difficult to measure. Where can discrimination shape opportunity? Research has identified racial discrimination across several areas that directly affect opportunity. In employment, discrimination can affect hiring, promotions, wages, and workplace treatment. In housing, it can affect access to housing, neighborhoods, and lending. Research has also examined discrimination in credit and consumer markets. These areas are connected. Employment influences income, income influences housing, housing can influence educational opportunities, and those opportunities can influence future economic mobility. So unequal treatment in one area can contribute to disadvantages in another. This leads to the idea of cumulative disadvantage. Imagine that unequal treatment results in a reduced opportunity. That reduced opportunity may contribute to an economic disadvantage, which can often access to other resources. Those differences can then influence future opportunities. Over time, disadvantages can accumulate. Sociologists argue that racial disparities in areas such as housing, education, employment, health, credit, and justice are interconnected rather than completely separate issues. This means discrimination may not be one isolated event. It can be part of a process where disadvantages build upon one another over time. The consequences of discrimination aren't limited to economic opportunity. Research has also examined the relationship between racism and health. Conducted a systematic review and made analysis involving 293 studies. They found associations between racism and poor mental health, general health, and physical health outcomes. This is important because it shows how a social experience can have consequences for individual well-being. Experiencing discrimination can be stressful, and repeated experiences may contribute to broader psychological and physical consequences. However, these findings don't mean that every person who experiences discrimination will develop a particular health problem. Rather, the research identifies broader associations across populations. That distinction is important when interpreting scientific evidence. So what does broader evidence show? I also want to look beyond one study and examine the broader research. A 2024 umbrella review examined 8 meta-analyses representing more than 1 million individuals and looked at 15 potential health outcomes. Overall, the research continued to identify associations between racial discrimination and multiple health outcomes. But the authors also identified limitations. Much of the evidence is observational, and the quality of some underlying studies varied. I think this is important because good research requires us to consider limitations rather than only focusing on findings that support our expectations. Science helps us understand what the evidence tells us, while also showing us what we still need to learn. If racial and ethnic discrimination continues, the consequences can extend across multiple levels. Individuals may experience stress, reduced opportunities, and lower well-being. Families may experience economic disadvantages that affect mobility across generations. Communities may experience persistent inequality, unequal access to resources, and reduced trust. Institutions can also be affected when people lose confidence in organizations they believe have treated them unfairly. Ultimately, Repeated unequal treatment can turn individual disadvantages into broader structural inequalities. Another important question is, who benefits from an unequal system? The answer isn't simply one particular racial or ethnic group. Potential beneficiaries can include individuals who receive preferential treatment, organizations that maintain advantageous practices, groups that benefit from unequal access to resources. There's also an important distinction between benefiting from inequality and intentionally creating it. So sociology just examines not only individuals' intentions, but also how advantages and disadvantages are distributed across society. Another question is, who has the power to influence how the problem is understood? Government influences the issue. Businesses influence it through employment. Media influences it through public perception. Advocacy groups can raise awareness, and researchers contribute through data, evidence, and measurement. How a social problem is framed matters because the way we define a problem often influences which solutions we consider appropriate. If discrimination is viewed only as individual prejudice, the solution may focus on changing individuals' attitudes. If it is understood as a structural issue as well, solutions can include organizational accountability, policy changes, research, and data collection. So who should do something about this problem? Everyone. It's not just a role. Not everyone has a role, but different groups have different responsibilities. Individuals can change stereotypes, examine their assumptions, and speak up when they see discrimination. Business and organizations can review their processes, educational institutions can teach, and government can enforce. The important point is that no single group can solve a problem that operates across multiple levels of society. This brings me to what I believe is one of the most important parts of addressing this problem, the role of science and research. Research helps us identify where discrimination occurs and measures how widespread it may be. This is important because good intentions don't automatically produce good outcomes. This gives us an example of research moving beyond identifying a problem and beginning to identify potential strategies and addressing it. Ultimately, we cannot effectively address a social problem that we cannot accurately identify, measure, or evaluate. Based on research, I believe addressing racial and ethnic discrimination requires 4 steps. We have to recognize the problem and acknowledge that discrimination can occur, measure it using reliable research and data, act by implementing evidence-based strategies, and evaluate whether those strategies actually improve outcomes. Social change isn't simply about creating a policy or making a statement. It's about determining whether the change actually makes a difference. To conclude, racial and ethnic discrimination is more than an individual problem. It can shape everyday interactions, influence access to opportunities and resources, contribute to cumulative inequality, affect health and well-being, and impact individuals, families, communities, and institutions. My own experience is what initially made me curious about this topic, but the research helped me understand that individual experiences can be connected to much larger social patterns. And I think that's ultimately why sociology matters. It gives us the tools to move beyond asking whether discrimination exists and instead ask, why does it happen, who is affected, and what can be done about it. Social change requires more than good intentions. It requires evidence, accountability, and sustained action. These are my academic resources I use to support my research, along with the course textbook. And again, thank you so much for listening. Have a good night.